Hi, PerspectaWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Tuesday, September 4th. A hot and humid day here in the Mid-Atlantic region. It looks like it'll stay hot and humid right into the day on Thursday. Then a cool frontal system arrives late Thursday, probably with some scattered showers and thunderstorms. A big cool down comes for Friday and Saturday. It looks like it stays comfortable on Sunday as well. But the bigger story is what's going on in the tropics. We've talked about an active period coming to the tropics, and indeed we're there. Looks like for the next couple of weeks it will remain quite active as we approach the climatological peak of the Atlantic Basin tropical season, which is typically right around the middle part of the month. Right now there's 3 systems to monitor. There could be a 4th and a 5th over the next few days here. First of all, we have Tropical Storm Gordon out over the Gulf of Mexico. Then Tropical Storm Florence out over the Atlantic Ocean, and not far off the west coast of Africa right here we have a 3rd system that very likely will become a tropical storm or hurricane over the next several days. Let's focus in on the tropical scene right now, as we have a lot of activity not only right now, but again it looks like for about the next 2 weeks. Well, let's start off by looking at an infrared satellite imagery loop from the Wisconsin website. First of all, out of the Gulf of Mexico right here, Tropical Storm Gordon. It very well could become a weak hurricane before it makes landfall late tonight, probably in the after midnight hours around the Louisiana-Mississippi border region. Again, it could reach hurricane status level 1 by the time it makes that landfall. Now, whether or not it reaches hurricane status, it'll provide a serious storm surge and, of course, some heavy rainfall amounts for the northern central part of the Gulf states, and then it'll continue northwest into the interior part of the nation and cause some heavy rainfall over the south central U.S. and some of that rain could eventually work its way to the north and east into the mid-Atlantic or northeast U.S. Meanwhile, out over the Atlantic, here we are, Tropical Storm Florence, just under hurricane status right now, but it is encountering some hostility in the environment. We'll look in a moment or two. There's still some dry air just ahead of it that it has to get through. Some dry air that came off the African west coast, Saharan dust, desert air really, and we'll see in a moment here. It's just ahead of it. Once it gets beyond that, it could intensify noticeably. Meanwhile, a 3rd tropical system right here spinning off the west coast of Africa, and you'll notice here several waves across the heartland of Africa. Again, an active period here in the Atlantic Basin tropical areas for the next couple of weeks. As far as current radar loop over the Gulf of Mexico, this area right here associated with Tropical Storm Gordon, again generally moving to the northwest. It is tropical storm status right now. Could become a weak hurricane by the time it reaches right in this area right here, the Louisiana-Mississippi border region. After midnight tonight, it should make landfall. Impressive storm surge certainly likely associated with Gordon, and then heavy rainfall amounts across much of the north-central part of the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, Mississippi, right in the crosshairs of this area of heavy rainfall. Now let's shift back to the east here and focus in on Florence. This is the map that comes from the University of Wisconsin website. All these reds and yellows and oranges represent dry air that came off the Saharan desert region of Africa, moved from the east to the west in the trade winds. Still some of that just ahead of Florence. Here is Florence right now continuing on a northwest track, so it has some hostility to encounter. May hold its own right now over the next 24 hours or so. It certainly does. I do not expect a lot of strengthening because of this dry air, but once it gets beyond that, it very likely will intensify. Again, a little bit of dry air still ahead of Florence, but once it gets beyond that, it should intensify. Meanwhile, here's that 3rd wave behind Florence, just off the west coast of Africa. It too will encounter some dry air, but once it gets beyond that, 5 days from now, for example, it very well could become tropical storm or even reach hurricane status. Well, let's now focus in on the all-important 500 millibar height anomaly forecast maps from last night's run of the ensemble version of the GFS. with respect to Florence, there is certainly concern because we have all this high pressure ridging, all these higher heights than normal up across the northeast U.S., the North Atlantic. That always sets off a red flag this time of the year because underneath is where tropical systems have an open window in many cases to move from the east to the west right towards the U.S. East Coast, and that is certainly a threat with respect to Florence. There will be a deep trough that we'll see in a moment that will slide slowly to the east over the latter part of the week and the upcoming weekend. Florence could very well be picked up by that trough and pushed to the north and east out into the open North Atlantic. But it's not a guarantee, and if it remains behind, if it doesn't get picked up by that trough, it very well could have an impact on the U.S. East Coast next week or thereabouts. So we'll have to monitor it closely, maybe a 50-50 chance right now that gets picked up by the trough. And we'll see this trough on this forecast in a moment here. Again, it's a close call whether or not Florence is left behind. And if it's left behind, high pressure will build in the North Atlantic again, and it could open the door for Florence to eventually move towards the U.S. East Coast. Well, let's move forward here, starting off with lots of orange here, higher heights than normal over southeastern part of Canada. And again, that allowed Gordon to cross southern Florida into the Gulf of Mexico and continue on a northwest path. Winds flow clockwise around high pressure regions, and that is pushing that along to the north and west. Let's move ahead in 6-hour increments here. And this is Florence right in this particular region right here as reflected in the 500 millibar height anomaly forecast maps. Again, Gordon moves into Louisiana, Mississippi late tonight and then sits and spins around there for a couple of days. Here we are now to the middle part of this week. This is Wednesday morning, and here's this trough starting to show up here over Canada here by Thursday. And by this time, Florence is out over the open part of the Atlantic Ocean, and this is the trough right here. By the time we get to Friday afternoon over the eastern part of Canada, here's a little reflection of Florence. Again, this trough will continue to the east, and there's a chance that Florence kind of gets picked up into this flow and pushes off quickly to the north and east out into the northern Atlantic. It is not a guarantee, however. If indeed it remains behind here, and here we are now to Sunday of the upcoming weekend, if it remains behind, then watch what happens right here. This is the worrisome feature right here. This high pressure area by the early part of next week just builds into the southeastern part of Canada, the northern Atlantic, and if indeed this is Florence, and it may not even be Florence, this could be that follow-up system by this time, that has a potential open door to the U.S. East Coast with this kind of a pattern by the early part of next week. So that's a concern right now. We have a lot of high pressure to the north. If Florence does not get picked up by that trough over the latter part of the week, the early part of the weekend, it could very well have an impact on the East Coast sometime next week. And if not Florence, the system or two following Florence very well could take that southern track towards the islands or the Gulf of Mexico next week and maybe the following week as well. So again, we have quite an active period for at least the next week to two as we reach this climatological peak here of the Atlantic Basin tropical season. So certainly stay tuned to PerspectaWeather.com over the next several days. A lot going on from Gordon to Florence and a couple systems behind Florence over the next several days. That's it for now. For PerspectaWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.